Good evening, my name is Lea Bambergers. I'm sorry, I'm fighting a cold, so I have a hard time talking loudly. If you can't hear me, just let me know. I'll do my best.
I am just going to cough drop.
Oh, perfect. So I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Providence.
And I'm Jeffrey Dane. I'm the city's City Solicitor.
The city what?
City Solicitor.
City Solicitor.
So as I think Mackie did a really great job teeing this up, this is a very complex challenge. And one layer that was not talked about is the fiscal aspect behind it. And so with Providence Water, we have that to manage with the city. So we're going to kind of give a brief overview of where we are at in our process and our thinking of how we not only ensure that our water supply is protected, not just for current Providence residents, state residents, the 60% of residents in the state that do rely on it, but for future generations as well. And we really want to get into questions and have this be as much as a dialogue as possible. We know we don't know what we don't know, and we want to hear what you all have to say. And while I think the city has done a very good job of taking into consideration the future protections of the water supply in its process, we would love to hear your ideas on that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Okay. I like what Mackie said about the three-sentence explanations. This topic definitely does not lend itself to...
I'm sorry. Can you speak up, please?
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
So this topic definitely doesn't lend itself to a three-sentence discussion, but it is the Water Supply Board and what the city is attempting to do with it with respect to the city's pension and how it's connected to sustainability of the water supply, the drinking water supply for 60% of the state, is very interrelated, complex, and difficult to explain. And we do want to focus on just some questions and answers, but I'll try to give, as best I can, a brief summary of what the city is trying to do and why. So the City of Providence has tried several times over the last few decades to utilize its ownership of Providence water supply in a way that can help address pension shortfalls that the city has. This is a new attempt that the city is trying to do. When this current administration came into the City Hall about 4 years ago, the mayor got a grant to commission a very comprehensive study by outside consultants on various problems, including the pension system and what solutions exist. And while there are lots of little things that were recommended for the city to do to try to deal with the fact that the pension fund is so severely underfunded, the main one and the only one of real significance was retrieving revenue from the water supply. So that is what the city has been trying to do to stabilize the pension fund. So the city's pension fund is about 25% funded, which is a very bad ratio. The city's finances otherwise are going in a positive direction and have been improving. But the pension fund, in trying to get it to a place where it's not so severely funded and at risk of potential insolvency, is a very challenging thing to tackle for the city. And that's where the city has been trying to figure out a way to effectively do that with the water supply in a way that doesn't negatively impact the quality of the drinking water, the availability of the drinking water, the rates that people pay for the drinking water. And fortunately, there are a lot of examples of this sort of thing being done throughout the country for different reasons. It tends to be more common for smaller water supplies to work with larger operations and leasing operations in leasing the actual functioning of the water supply out west, where they're doing it to try to keep down rates sometimes where rates are very high because of scarcity, or to deal with other issues that water systems deal with. There are several communities, several municipalities that have done something like what we're trying to do for the same reason that Providence is, to deal with a pension system that is at risk of insolvency. Before we get to questions, I don't want to, I could go on and on and on and on, and I don't want to go off into all kinds of different directions, but just one of, oh, go ahead, did you have a question?
Well, I invited you guys to come, and
Yes.
you sent us this 80-page document about leasing the system, which is a different strategy than we have seen before. So if you could just explain that a little bit.
Okay, yeah, no, that absolutely, and that is actually what we were trying to do last year, and also the year before. The first year we were trying to encourage the state to create a statewide water authority, which then would have the authority to do leasing agreements with the various municipal water supplies, including Providence. Last year was a much simpler bill that we submitted, which also would have permitted leasing. So what we've done before even submitting any kind of enabling legislation is we've issued an RFQ, a request for qualifications. We used outside counsel to help us draft this document, where we're hoping to get different qualified operators who would be willing to submit to us their basically demonstration that they would be qualified operators of the Providence water system. And with we also tried to utilize that RFQ document as a bit of a statement of what we're looking for. So not just that you're qualified to operate a water supply system, but that it's language included in the RFQ is that if you're going to enter into an agreement with the city to operate Providence Water, there's going to have to be short and long-term rate stability, that protection of the watershed and drinking water quality, and recognition of collective bargaining entities who are the collective bargaining agents for the labor pool of Providence Water. So they're basically, in the main categories is rates, safe drinking water and environmental protection and labor protections. Those were sort of the highlights we tried to lay out there for any potential operators who would want to submit a response to our RFQ. Is that?
Yeah, so this would also require enabling legislation too?
It would probably require some form of legislation for us to move forward.
Okay.
Probably.
And I just add that one of the ways that, and maybe this is a helpful analogy is how we're approaching it, is that if you're familiar with like an energy service contract or an ESCO, right, they come to you, they look at your building, they say, I think we can get X amount of efficiency, they do all that work, you get the savings, but they take a cut. It's a very similar process through a long-term lease.
Yep.
And so this RFQ process, which I think was shared, or the RFQ was shared, we're very, I think, aware that we're sacrificing some of that lump sum, like that, the cash, essentially, for these other factors. And it is a balance, and it's like the perfect sustainability case study where you're balancing fiscal or economic, social, labor issues, and of course environmental issues. And again, this is something that we'll see what we get. It's probably not going to be the most responded to RFQ. I think a lot of folks might look at this and say, no, it will pass because of those stipulations. But we do feel strongly that those aspects of labor and the environment are just as important as the fiscal side of things.
Yeah, and that was the advice we were given, that it's not going to be the most attractive RFQ for operators, but we're not, our intention is not to get the most respondents, it's to get respondents that would be willing to operate under the conditions we're placed.
And this is of course also, as as Jeff explained from the get-go, this is a strategy to hopefully try to avoid bankruptcy at any point, and that would be even a worst case scenario for our water supply and the health of our water supply and protecting it should that happen.
Yeah. And just on that note, I know that term tends to freak people out. The city, this is really a very forward-thinking. The city is not at the precipice of bankruptcy, but you can see very clearly if you look and analyze our pension fund and where it's at and actuarial numbers, that having a pension fund that is so underfunded as this puts us at risk, at significant risk, depending upon different factors that could happen over the next 10 to 15 years, for us not having sufficient funds. And that would be a very bad situation for the city and the state. So, you had a question?
Yeah, just so I'm clear on it, maybe you had clarity on it in your previous discussion, but is this, with the RFQ, is that in lieu of the past initiatives and ideas of selling the water system?
Well, we haven't had any, I mean, I guess, I don't know if maybe in the far past there were ideas of selling the system, but we've never proposed selling the system.
Yeah.
Well, there was
Privatization.
considerable discussion, you know, last year during this General Assembly session, you know, on that topic. That's what
There were
I'm wondering.
discussions by some people that seemed to think that was what was happening, but at no point did we propose selling the water system. Yes.
Well, then I'm confused because the phrase that I always heard was, it was discussion and even legislation proposed, which I testified against, on privatization of the Providence water supply.
They call it monetizing.
Monetizing.
Monetizing,
Oh,
which is
okay.
different than privatizing.
Well, then I have a further question unrelated to the different line of questioning, but to what extent has the town of Scituate been involved in anything related to it?
I mean, the town of Scituate receives pilot payments, and I think that...
I think there's a tax agreement.
yeah,
Yeah,
no.
Yep.
Similar to...
but it's similar to, but it's slightly
Yes.
different because it's long-term
Yeah.
and it's negotiated, so, yeah. So, I mean, in that, I understand that, that's been the case, but in the legislation for monetization of the water supply, to my knowledge, the town of Scituate was not engaged with that at all. They were not invited. No one from Scituate was there.
Last year, no. 2 years ago, there were a lot of folks from Scituate there, but last
A lot of folks there in what capacity?
testifying.
Well, yeah, and I was one of them last year, but in the actual committee that was making the decisions that put together the legislation, there was no engagement by the town of Scituate. And are you making any accommodation to Scituate in this case?
Well, two years ago, the city of Providence reached out to the leadership of Scituate, and there were discussions with folks from the town council there, but last year I don't believe there were.
Why not?
I don't know.
What research has been done to come up with other possible solutions to compensate for the pension funds? Like, you know.
Well, there's about a 130-page report, and it's public document. You can get on the city's website. There's an entity called the National Resource Network, which does this kind of consulting work that did a very, very thorough, they spent several months putting together this report for the city, and it's in sort of an analysis of the pension system and the various possible ways to address the pension system.
And is it using like new innovative solutions, like for example, maybe like replacing water system old pipes that have like turbines in them, so to capture like hydraulic power and like solar panels on all the roofs in Providence, like utilizing all possible.
It did include things like creating a stormwater utility. It included things like a potential tax on parking lots, it includes all of those things, and it says you must do all of those things and this.
And it included renewable energy too.
Yeah, for example, you actually will be ribbon cutting tomorrow for a solar farm that the city is participating in, and it's going to save us $800,000 a year. So we're doing all that. There's nothing at scale presently in terms of those technologies that will equate to the hundreds of millions of dollars that is needed.
What is the difference between monetization and a public-private partnership?
I mean, I don't, I'm not even sure really how to answer. There's all kinds of different public-private partnerships. There are communities that use public-private partnerships to build schools.
Right.
So I don't, they're just, monetization is, I guess, in a general sense, utilizing an asset to derive some revenue.
Right.
Whereas a public-private partnership is a public entity working with a private entity to achieve some end goal.
So this would be the same then, because we're reaching out to private entities to work with this public entity to achieve a goal, which is be monetization?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a private entity. It could be another public entity. So it could be a public-public partnership. It could be a public-private partnership. Right. We don't know where we'll end up. I think first there was hand up. Yes. I'm sorry, were you first?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make another comment about Scituate. Is that I didn't really know what happened 2 years ago when they reached out to the town council. I just wanted to point out, to take back to whoever, that the town council looks a lot different right now than it did 2 years ago since the previous election.
Yeah.
So if it's found out that whatever talks were happening there led to whatever outcome, that there would probably be a different outcome this time. So.
Thank you. Yes.
I have three quick ones. The lands involved around the watershed that protect all the water quality, will those be inalienable? Will those be guaranteed not to be sold off or developed?
That would be the intention.
Okay. One suggestion that I've seen discussed, but not a whole lot, is that rather than a monetization in the way you're talking about, that a legislation to raise rates on the towns that take water from the wholesale rates are low, and they seem to have a float between the wholesale and the retail, and cutting some of the raising the wholesale rates would provide a very large amount of money. So has that been, seriously looked at?
I mean, certainly that could, but
is that more difficult legislation?
Probably be a more challenging piece of legislation than this.
I still think that might be a better solution. And the last is, at least in the last version that I saw, it was an attempt to cut the Public Utilities Commission out of rate setting. And is that still there? And if so, why would we even consider taking out the PUC?
No, so the both years of legislation, we haven't drafted legislation this year yet. But in both instances, the intention was to not have PUC have oversight over the transaction itself, but then have rate setting authority subsequent to the transaction.
I still worry about that one. I think that we need that public process in the PUC to make sure that this goes well for all the people in Rhode Island, and especially those in the city.
Yes.
We've heard news of scofflaws in real estate taxes, property taxes on a commercial level. Is there a scofflaw problem with water rates? Are there industries which have abandoned their industry and left the city with their unpaid bills?
No, we don't have a major issue with unpaid bills, no.
So the consumers of water are up to date and
I mean, not 100%, but pretty high. And actually, in terms of the tax scofflaws, the rates of recovery have actually increased. I mean, we don't have a significant problem at all of unpaid real estate taxes. Yes.
So this strategy that you're proposing is kind of similar to what many municipalities have been doing with their wastewater infrastructure over the past 30 years or so, privatization to contract operators or quasi-public entities such as the Narragansett Bay Commission, right? Yes. Would the Narragansett Bay Commission be a consideration to take over this water system?
That's what the bill was last year.
Certainly, the Narragansett Bay Commission did submit their own bill last year, which would have permitted them to enter into these kinds of agreements with Providence Water or other water utilities as well. I mean, I'm sure Narragansett Bay Commission is well aware of the RFQ, and presuming they respond, they would be one of the potential entities.
I think there's a hand up back there.
Land ownership. Who owns the land in the watershed?
Well, we certainly would maintain that the city
Can you
of Providence.
speak loud?
I'm sorry. We certainly maintain that the city of Providence does.
They own a large portion of it. I have the numbers. They own about, Providence Water City owns about a third of the watershed, about 5,000 parcels.
What about the other 2/3?
Some are deemed as not high priority for the protection of the water, and others are, there's some that, so currently, about, and I think it was in '89, the state legislature authorized 45 parcels to be acquired by eminent domain if necessary, and so Providence Water is continuing this process of acquiring properties that are high priority for protecting the watershed. Of those 45, 32 have they purchased willingly, so willing seller situation, and then 5 of them have gone through or are in the legal process.
Is that ownership with no restrictions, no deeded restrictions?
So sometimes the Providence Water, the city will just buy the development rights to a parcel.
No, the 1/3 that you currently own, if you were to sell, are you allowed to sell?
Is the city?
Yes.
I will double check with Providence Water, but my understanding is that maybe other people know more about if there is state legislation that would prohibit the city, and that's part of the concern about if the city was in front of a bankruptcy judge and we had those assets, that would be we're trying to avoid that situation of where that land is at risk for being sold.
And the city's focus hasn't been on actually selling, so we haven't gone too in-depth into
I'd like
sales
to
rights.
see if there can be some research done on indigenous rights. My understanding is that if the city of Providence were to sell, it reverts back to indigenous land sovereignty, and that's why you're leasing. But if you can take a look at that.
I can actually, so that actually did come up in my conversation with Providence Water today. And she predicted this question more or less. I guess there's some thought out there that if any of those parcels were to be sold, there would be like a right of first refusal by the previous owners, not necessarily indigenous, but by the last owner. And their legal advice has been that that is not the case. That is not in fact true. But so that's their perspective at this point. And I think just to be clear, the city owns that land presently. We're not proposing selling that land. We're proposing leasing essentially the management of the water supply. So if I were, to own a whole bunch of land and I lease out part of it, or I lease the land, that doesn't give you the right to then to sell it to someone else. So the ownership would still remain with the city.
The other question is, you mentioned that there's a report that was produced and other options of funding the pension plan. You worked with a consultant. My question is, have you done community consultas? What kind of consultation have you done with the community, and what kind of participatory budgeting have you entertained and discussed with community?
Well, I know the city did that when, at the time, and the folks from the National Resource Network met with folks throughout the city at the time. I mean, it was a several-month process, but that was a few years ago.
And not only, so that was, there was an input process. They interviewed numerous stakeholders and community members, but then also, once the report was created, there was sort of this road show, went neighborhood to neighborhood and hosted presentations and explained and got feedback on it as well.
So who was interviewed? Because I'm the Environmental Justice League of Rhode Island. We also have a Racial Environmental Justice Committee.
Yeah, that didn't, the REJC didn't exist at the time. It predated that, but we can find out who.
Yeah, would like to, and invariably when these things happen, same thing with Connector 610. 10 years ago they talked to community members, so they don't have to talk now. Really, when a decision is made, it should be done with a community that's going to be impacted now in the present, with those hearings and with those discussions and conversations. I do want to share the concern about climate change. California just recently had a GCAS summit, Global Climate Action Summit. Jerry Brown and grassroots organizations, people of color, indigenous communities stood up against that monetization and commodification of our natural resources. And the indigenous community came together with a proposal. This is a global proposal from the indigenous community that is in Spanish. It's very short, but I do want to read it. It's in Spanish, and I just translated it into English. It's important to take into consideration the larger climate crisis, and also look at other cities where monetization and privatization has happened, like Detroit, and what consequences that has had for their population. But to quickly say, water is life. It is a live being with its rights. The proposal is conservar nuestro territorio bajo nuestra visión de vida. Preserve the land and territory under our indigenous vision of life. 2, keep dejar el petróleo bajo tierra, keep it in the ground. 3, que el gobierno reconozca nuestro derecho a conservar nuestro territorio y estilo de vida. Demand that governments recognize our rights to preserve our territory, our land, and our lifestyle. And it is the preservation of that land and that land sovereignty and that relationship with water, land, air, that indigenous communities know how to live in that right relationship and to restore those habitats. It's truly the solution for climate change. It's a 3-point solution, not very complex, but it's something that the capitalist society and the those who want to capitalize and monetize and commodify all the natural resources have a problem and struggle with. So I really want to put this forward because this is the global south, the global north, the global east and west. These were indigenous communities meeting from all over the world, asking for this recognition that they give back the land to the way of living and have that, allow them to have that sovereignty so that they can restore the ecosystem and the habitat. I don't see that happening here, and I don't see any conversations with the indigenous communities. I'm part of the Indigenous Peoples Network. Nobody has approached us to these are the true landowners, where, I mean, these are stolen lands, and we really need to recognize where we're standing. I also want to lift the fact that while the Regional Environmental Justice Committee didn't exist, there is a just transition framework that was adopted by the City of Providence that needs to be filtered through and really take into consideration a community-owned water board and sign a benefits agreement with the City of Providence, a community benefits agreement we need to protect. And we need to look at what's happened in Detroit, that as much as they've wanted to protect, the water bills have hiked up. That has left families without being able to pay bills, and children being taken out of families because children cannot live in homes that have no sanitation. And this cannot happen. It impacts all the fabric of society.
Sure. And I mean, Detroit's a good example of something we're trying to avoid. That we don't want to be in the same situation as Detroit. So we're trying to do something about it before we don't have the ability to do something about it.
So you mentioned 3 examples where this has worked, or other examples of cities that you're trying to sort of emulate?
We've looked at lots of them,
So
but I
you
mean,
want to name a few that you think are good examples?
Well, Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Actually, Allentown and Scranton, Pennsylvania, have both done. The thing is, I start naming them. You say, wait a minute, this is different. They all have their own.
No, I know, but
and
mostly
then,
I hear about privatization or monetization not working, the way you were just describing.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in ones that did work.
And so Allentown was interesting, where it was a regionalization, which was more similar to the approach we were trying to take a couple of years ago, where the state would take would create a statewide board. There's a lot of like water districts out west that have done this sort of thing. I'm happy to send you more
That'd be great.
information about that. Yes.
I think we got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and then
3 and 4 hands.
Yeah, of course.
I'll let you.
Ken?
Yeah, quickly, have you had any discussions, or have you looked at anything that Veolia Water has done?
Yeah.
They're a French-based company, global. They took over the Cranston sewage treatment plant some years ago. And I'm just wondering if there are any practical, workable experiences that they have that Providence might be looking at.
I'm sure they have. That would be one entity that could potentially respond.
And again, we hope to learn a lot through this RFQ process, and it's an RFQ, not an RFP. Like, there's multiple layers. This is an investigative process. If we all are really quick, we can do 1, 2, 3, 4 more. I mean, this is ambitious.
These companies, like, I don't know what the qualifications are, but companies that have a lot of experience with privatizing water and taking over the systems, like, then they're corporations, they have subsidiaries, maybe they can twist it so like they're highlighting their successes and not where they have gone wrong. But like, the water does not have borders. So if a company comes in and does the wrong thing, like, even though they're leasing the land, they do not have, like, it's not their water. So they don't have a connection to the resource. So even though I respect these, the way that you're approaching it, that is making it harder, that isn't as desirable for companies to come in, but corporations under Citizens United, they have the rights that they have, even if they came in and this was the agreement and they signed an agreement and said, yeah, I'm doing this, it doesn't matter, because as a corporation, they can, in court, they can still win, or they could just drown us all of our money and take all of the money from the state, fighting them in court until we have to give up because we don't have the money to fight them. So they don't have rules. Like, there is no, like, contract, because the contract means nothing to them.
I hear you, and just so we can get to everyone, I hear you, and they will have a contract, right? That they'll have oversight from the PUC as well, from rates. Like, this is
But
not
they don't have to adhere to
over.
a contract because they're a corporation and they have more power because of the way that the money works in court
Well, we
of
have
law.
a great city solicitor.
They wouldn't be leasing the land, they would have to adhere to a contract, and they still would have PUC oversight for their infrastructure.
Just as much as the city does, right? You know,
Yeah.
it's,
I mean, right?
you want to go to other questions?
You just keep making reference to water systems out west. Western water rights are totally different than eastern water rights. And to say that something's happening out west under the western laws and where their water comes from is very different than what we have.
In New Jersey, Midwest, I mean, I could, there's...
No, I know, but I think it's unfair to say that, you know, because it worked out in
They give us some
Wyoming.
East Coast examples.
We can give you several dozen
Right, no, I'm just-
examples from
Point
all different geographies.
Thank you. And in the back.
I yield to Eugenia, who had her hand up a long time.
I was interested in the issue of the forestry and knowing that the city of Providence uses the forest there, manages the forest, exploits, not in a bad way, exploits the resource. And so when you said, you suggested that a corporation would take over the functions, and watershed protection, exactly how would that land management and the sale of timber and the protection of water quality be addressed?
And if I could piggyback on that, if there was tax revenue generated from those types of activities, how would that impact your taxed arrangement with the town of Scituate?
Well, it wouldn't be tax revenue. So it should have no impact on the tax arrangement of the town of Scituate.
Would you address the forestry question that was asked, please?
And that would be something that would have to be worked out with whoever the operator would be. I mean, as we laid out in the RFQ, whoever's going to operate it or would have an intention to enter into a long-term leasing agreement for operation and management would have to comply with the standards that we set for the watershed.
They would also have to, Providence Water has a water supply, a water quality protection plan that the Water Resource Board approves and oversees. They would still have to do all that and adhere to the current plan that's in place. We're going to do this as well.
I'll do quick. One of the people who was advising the mayor on this was Stephen Goldsmith, who's former mayor of Indianapolis, who privatized water there. And then now Indianapolis had to fight to get control of their water back. Since then, he now works for the Hampton Institute, which is a very right-wing group that's all about privatization. And I know we're calling it monetization, but with those kind of advisors in the background, doesn't that kind of put a... yeah, sure.
He was one of our consultants. He's no longer one of the city's consultants.
Why was he let go?
Huh?
Why was he let go?
We just decided to go a different direction for outside counsel.
Okay.
Do one last one, and then we'll thank you very much for coming.
So you said that it was a long-term lease, so if the managers violated the terms of the contract or, you know, terms of responsible forestry management or whatever, is there a way to pull back management rights from them for the city of Providence to take back those management rights, or is the lease given to them?
No, I mean, like the critical pieces are exactly what is in the transaction. So in the agreement that you enter into with whoever would be, again, you would not be transferring ownership or possession of the land. It would be for operating and managing the utility. So if it's done in that fashion, the city is not relinquishing the level of control that I think is behind some of the concerns. Not all of them, but behind some.
So if the private corporation violated the terms of the contract, would the contract be nullified and the city would take control of the...
No, well, it'll be a pretty big, complex contract, so there'll be all kinds of provisions for making sure that the parties comply with them. So,
and if they don't?
there'll be some consequence. But this will probably be a several dozen page agreement, so it depends, it depends on the details.
I mean, any legal arrangement, although when it comes into conflict, becomes, at least in some big part, about the legal resources at each side's disposal. And if a corporation's doing well and the city of Providence is already in a situation where where it's short of funds and is doing something to deal with bankruptcy, kind of, at least as a citizen, that makes me feel concerned.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is a situation where the city is trying to look really forward. The city is not on the verge of bankruptcy. The city is functioning just fine, and we deal with many legal disputes constantly, and we do not shortchange. We don't pinch pennies. I mean, we're careful. We're very careful with our budget, but we don't like roll over in legal battles because we can't afford to not do so.
Have you ever been sued by a major corporation?
So guys, we're gonna have to cut this off.
All the time.
And
Constantly.
I want to thank you guys both very much for coming and having a dialogue with us. Really appreciate it.
I would also just add, it's an 80-page RFP, sounds really daunting. The substance of it is not. It's like 13 pages of like what's actually important. So you have the link, take a look at it. I'm happy to, we're happy to field follow-up questions as you have.
For sure. No, we're very...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.